Well, I have another one I'd like to talk about too.
Yes.
Take a few minutes. It's
Yes.
the only approved apparition that's ever occurred in the United States.
Which one is it?
A Lady of Good Health,
Oh, yes.
Champion, Wisconsin.
Champion, Wisconsin, yeah, okay. And also, I love that you brought extra prayers. Please pray, if you have favorite prayers, that prayer for unborn children to the sacred mixed blood of Mary and Jesus in the womb was incredible.
I have two, if you'd like to
Oh, I
say,
love one. Yeah,
if
just a
anybody else
beautiful-
would like it. I thought it sounded like such a lovely thing that they're doing. They have an enrollment card that they passed out at their church, and it's a spiritual adoption novena. And I guess you're supposed to be saying this every day. You're supposed to write the name, who you are, and the name selected for the unborn baby, and that you adopt. And then I guess at Christmas time, they're going to have a special celebration. As
Because
the
those babies
conclusion
hopefully
of this.
are born.
Yes, and I guess as we know yesterday, for those of us who were at Mass, it was the feast of the,
Annunciation.
right. And didn't Father do such a nice job talking about that and how this is where it really began, and with Mary, and you know, it really was tying in with what we're doing.
Oh, it
Which
ties
I
in.
never really thought about, that it's
Yes.
it.
Uh-huh.
And that's
Yeah.
kind of what he was saying, this
Mhm.
is it. Anyhow.
And it ties in with this new film that I think I mentioned last week, Unplanned. Did I mention Unplanned?
No, but that was in their bulletin at St. Joseph's.
There's it's coming out on March 29th. I think it's in Danbury and someplace else. But I saw a preview of it up in Bridgeport a couple of weeks ago. Please go and see it. It's the true story of a young woman who volunteered and then worked in a Planned Parenthood clinic, ultimately becoming the youngest Planned Parenthood director in the country. Her name is Abby Johnson. And she suffered 2 abortions herself, and ultimately she watches one on ultrasound, so she sees the baby disappear into the tube, and she's devastated because she had been telling, people had lied to her about what is abortion, and then she had been lying as a counselor to thousands of women, and she became a mother herself, and she did a complete 180 and became a sidewalk counselor, and all of what happens to her as a result of that change. It was a stunning movie, very, very, very powerful, and I think all young people and everybody should see it. It tells the truth and in a way that's never been told before by someone who was a Planned Parenthood director. You know? Going back to our Marian apparitions, so we've looked at the 12, right? And last week we picked up with Our Lady of Gieserwald, if you weren't here, and where in East Prussia, it's right on the Polish-German border today, Gieserwald, but back in 1877, Prussia had taken over that section of Poland, and they were suppressing the Polish culture and the Catholic Church. And when Our Lady appears to 2 little girls, Justyna Zafranska and Barbara Samulowska, she speaks Polish, and that became thrilling to them because they weren't allowed to speak Polish. And there's Our Lady appearing to these 2 little, they were 12 and 14, I think. And she tells them to pray and say the Rosary, and she tells them there's a spring. There's often a spring in these appearances, and they should go there and wash. And so the interesting thing was Justyna was on her way back from church, and she had stopped to say the Angelus, and she looked under a maple tree, and then she sees the whole maple tree is lit up, and then she sees the Madonna, and she was about to make her first communion, and she'd been going to religious instruction. And then Our Lady appeared for 3 months, and so the next time she brings her friend Barbara Samulowska, and she's when she appears, sometimes there's angels above her. Sometimes she's by the 3rd appearance, she's holding the child Jesus, and one of them, the child Jesus is holding an orb, you know, like the world with a cross on the top of it. So this became very, very encouraging to the people of Poland. They had not had an apparition. And it became almost a nationalistic thing as well as a devotion instigator. And these two young women become Sisters of Charity. And one, Justina, goes all the way to Guatemala as a missionary and dies there in the early, in like the 1950s or so. And then we talked about Mary's apparition in Knock, Ireland. Knock is in County Mayo. And just 2 years later, after Gitzeval, do you see how a lot of these approved ones pick up with, in the 1800s, Lourdes, Pontmain, Gitzeval, 1877 now, Knock, 1879. Unusual about Knock is that Mary never speaks, but it's pouring rain, and the housekeeper for the parish church in Knock, County Ireland, was walking to her friend's house, and she passed the gable end of the church, and she sees a bright, bright light, and it's pouring rain, and she looks at the blank wall, and she sees the figures, Mary standing in the middle, all the figures are dressed in white, with St. Joseph on her right and St. John the Evangelist on her left, and above them are angels, and to Mary's left is a vision of an altar with a lamb on top, and behind the lamb, the cross. So she runs to her friend's house. Mary, I forget what her friend's last name is McLaughlin, and she wants her friend to come and see this vision, but her friend doesn't want to go out in the rain, but her friend's youngest sister, Mary Burns, says, I'll go with you. And so the two girls go back to the church, and there's the vision still there. And so then they go to the rectory, and they try to get the parish priest, Father Kavanaugh, to come out, but he won't come out. Poor guy, he'll never live this down. But soon they tell other people in the small town, and a large number, I put here, one of the accounts said 15, I read another that said 29, so we don't know. Of all ages, from 6 to 75, they come, and they all see it, and they begin the rosary, and they pray the rosary for 2 hours, and the vision just stays there. Some of the people even had a temerity to walk up very close to the figures, and they said the figures look rounded and formed like real living people, except they were all white. And when they got too close to the figures stepped back a little bit. The figures were not flat up against the wall of the church. There was room for them to move back. Can you imagine? But there was no message. And so that's a huge shrine in Ireland today, and also up in the East Durham, New York, in the not the Catskills, is it the Adirondacks? And then we talked about Fatima, of course, probably the most famous, next that with Lourdes in Portugal in 1917, with the vision, many visions to 3 shepherd children. Always on the 13th of, they start, I think, in 1916, the children see angels who teach them prayers. But then starting in May of 1917, always on the 13th of the month, there's a series, and finishing in October. They get, not May, the 13th of June through the 13th of October. So June, July, August, September, October, 5 visions. They get a vision of hell. They get a request of world consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. She tells them to pray the Rosary to obtain the end of the Great War, World War I. Prophecy of the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. She requests the first Saturday devotions, and there's a total of 4 prayers that are taught. One of them, one that we say at the end of each decade of the Rosary. How does it start? How can I forget this? I say it. Oh my Jesus, forgive us our sins. Right, that one. And in the last vision, the last vision is the sun coming down, and there were huge thousands of people, and it was filmed. And so there's the disturbance of the celestial bodies. In one of the visions, she reveals 3 secrets. The secrets were one, the vision of hell, to save sinners from hell. 2, the Rosary devotions and devotion to the Immaculate Heart. And the third secret was the one of people climbing a mountain and a man dressed in white who is killed. And that was the one that was supposed to be revealed in 2000. And John Paul II decided not to reveal it, and it wasn't revealed until after he was shot. And he had a huge devotion to Our Lady of Fatima because he survived. That bullet came right next to his heart. And then we talked about the next 2 approved visions occurred in Belgium, one right after the other, one 12 days after the other. And Beauraing is right on the French-Belgian border. Belgium is a tiny country between France and Germany. And 5 local children saw this vision. One of the children was in town at school or possibly catechism class, and they were children from 2 families, 2 sisters and a brother in one family, and 2 sisters from another family. And 4 of the children decided to walk into town to meet the child that was walking home and to walk her home. And they saw this vision of Our Lady on a viaduct, against a stone viaduct. And she called herself I am the Immaculate Virgin. Pray. And she appears many times, and amongst the things that she says is, I am the Immaculate Virgin. Pray, pray, pray. Do you love my son? Do you love me? Sacrifice yourselves for me. And she eventually, she's always got her hands like this, and she's got a white gown that goes straight down, and she's got a crown with like rays of the sun, and then she separates her hands, the last 2 visions, and she exposes a golden heart. So she's sometimes known as Our Lady of the Golden Heart, Our Lady of Beauraing. Yes. And the first vision was against the viaduct, but she told him to go the next night to the garden of the convent where the young girl had been having instructions, but then the superior of the convent wouldn't let them in, and she barred the gate of the garden. And but a throng of people had come. By the next night she had relented, and so all the rest of the visions occur in a garden next to a convent. And 12 days later, a very extraordinary one, a very different one. These were devout children. These were children who raised in the faith. I love this one because it's a young girl named Mariette Becco, and she was the oldest of, I think it's 9 or 11 children, but a very, very poor family in a tiny town in Belgium, about 50 kilometers northeast of Beauraing. And there's no faith in this house. In fact, the father is very anti-Catholic and makes fun of the faith. And she had started as a child to go to religious instructions, but she had stopped going. She did very poorly, and she stopped going because she didn't understand it. And there was no support at home, and they rarely went to Mass. And the mother went along with the father in ridiculing devotion. But one night it was raining hard, and it was cold, and she was sitting by this, they lived in a very small 4-room cottage, and the father was an unemployed wire maker, and she's looking out the window waiting for her younger brother to come home, and she's worried about it, and then she sees this vision of Our Lady, and at first it looks like a ball of light, and then she sees the profile, and then she sees who it, and she knows who it is. And she had found in the road a string of rosaries that she picked up out of the road, and she had put it on her bedside table. So she ran and got it, and she went back to the window, and Our Lady was still there, and she begins to say the rosary. And then Our Lady beckons her to come out, and she does go out. And then eventually her brother comes home, and she tells her brother, and her brother believes her. Then about 3 days later, so every night she goes at 7 o'clock to the window, and her brother believes her. The next time she appears, she gets her mother and tells her to look. Do you see what I see? The mother can see light, but that's all she sees. She doesn't see the figure. And the mother says, oh, it's a witch. And then several times she brings her mother to the window and her mother makes fun of it. At one of the times she says, oh, I guess it's the Blessed Mother, you know. But then Our Lady beckons to her. She goes outside in the dark, and her father sees her running around in a strange frenzy. And then get down on the ground and bow down and so forth and assume a prayer position. And now he's worried about his daughter, that she's lost her mind, so he goes and tries to get her. And he sees it all happening. And she continues to appear, I forget, 8 visions, all right? And what I find so attractive, and the vision has no belt. She has the white gown. She has on her head, I forget what she has a crown. She has no shoes on, and one foot is showing, and there's a golden rose that between her toes. Very unusual. What's astounding, so she tells her brother, and her brother tells her she needs to go, or she tells her friend, and her friend tells her, you need to tell the parish priest, Father Jabin, but she's too embarrassed, so she doesn't do it. And her friend goes instead and tells the parish priest, and he's not really sure. But as a result of 2 of the visions, she loves Our Lady so much, and she's now saying the Rosary every day. And every time Our Lady shows up, she has her rosaries, and she says several decades before Our Lady starts talking. And Our Lady shows her a spring, just like all of them. And so she decides on her own to go back to religious instruction so she can make her first communion. And she's in class, and Father Jabin doesn't know what to make of her tale, but he sees a complete change in her, and suddenly she knows all her catechism. And she's very devout, and she's super motivated to make her first communion, and he can't get over it. And then, pretty soon, her father and her mother convert, and they go back to church. That didn't happen at Lourdes. It didn't happen with the parents at many of these apparitions, at Fatima, at Lulaus, right? And the parents don't believe, they make fun, but these parents convert immediately. And that really touched the heart of Father Jabin, and he goes to the bishop and so forth, and it goes on from there. I love that story. And what does she say? She calls her, Mariette Beckos asks her, who are you? And she said, I am the Virgin of the Poor. And this is a really poor family, unemployed father. Believe in me and I will believe in you. Drink from a small spring. And today that spring yields 2,000 gallons a day, and it's a spring of healing. Yeah. So that takes us to the end. That's what we did last time. I want to take a minute just to look at all of the messages, for the ones that have messages.
So they have a church at this spring today?
Yes, they
in
do.
Belgium? Oh,
Yes.
Mhm.
Pretty much, does she tell her? I don't know if she told them, but there is a shrine, because there's healings that take place at these springs. So there's a shrine or a chapel, there's always something. And when I put up all the pictures, you'll see it at the end. Our last meeting, you'll see all of these places. So let's just review all of her messages. What does she say at Guadalupe? Am I not here? I who am your mother, she tells Juan Diego. And she tells him to build a chapel and to go and speak to the bishop and so forth, and to bring the roses. In Silva, that's the wonderful one where the church was suppressed and the parish priest 80 years prior had buried, right? A beautiful woman holding a baby up here above where the lost icon of the Virgin and Jesus was buried. So there's no message. There's just a vision, and the old man, over 100, remembers burying it and they dig it up. At Lulaus, there is a message: build a chapel and a house for priests. It will become a place of conversions of numerous sinners. Anoint people with the oil of the sanctuary lamp. Do penance. In Rudebach, have a medallion struck. O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. At La Salette, she's weeping, weeping, weeping. And she does have a message: respect the name of God. Respect the rest of the Lord's Day, warning of famine to come if people do not repent. It's a message of conversion of all humanity to Christ. At Lourdes, I am the Immaculate Conception, pray and do penance for sinners, dig in the mud and drink from the spring, build a chapel. At Pontmain, remember the vision outside the barn, and only the children can see Our Lady of Pontmain. Pray, my children, there's still time. This was the invasion of France by Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War. My son allows himself to be touched by compassion, and then the army stops, and the general says, I couldn't go forward, there was a Madonna in the road. Gitzerwald, pray and say the Rosary, there is a spring, no message. Many people see it, and they stand in the rain saying the Rosary. At Fatima, many messages, all the secrets, request for the world consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, pray the Rosary to obtain the end of the war, prophecy of the triumph of her Immaculate Heart, for Saturday devotions, and all of the Fatima prayers. So an end of war. And also a tremendous concern for sinners, the vision of hell. Beaurain, pray, pray, pray. Do you love my son? Do you love me? Sacrifice yourself for me. And she shows her golden heart. And Bonheur, believe. I'm the Virgin of the poor. Believe in me, and I will believe in you. Drink from a small spring. That's just like Bernadette. What do you notice about all these messages? Is there a common theme? What does Our Lady want?
Pray to the Son, pray to my Son.
Prayer. Yes, pray to my son. She wants prayer. She also is very, very concerned about what segment of society?
Poor.
The poor and who else? Sinners. The thing that jumps out to me the most is her concern for sinners. And she wants reconciliation and honor for her son, the Lord's Day, the holiness of the name of Jesus, right? Those are the common themes of the messages. But what can we say about the visionaries themselves? Who does she appear to? Children. Mm-hmm. Very simple people. Mm-hmm. No priests. One religious, Catherine Labouré, right? Always to children. Isn't that extraordinary? I wonder, why do you think she doesn't appear? Well, there are, you're going to see, other appearances to adults, but in these approved ones, what is it about, why does she appear to children?
They have pure heart.
Pure hearts,
I
yeah.
think they're the most open.
And they're open,
to
right.
it.
Can you think of anything in the gospel that Jesus says that kind of parallels this approach of Mary to children, this self-revelation of Mary to children?
Suffer the little children to come unto me.
That's right. Of such is the kingdom of heaven. And what about Jesus' healings? Does he heal everybody who comes along, or who does he heal? He keeps saying what?
He heals the poor and the people who are very needy. He does heal some kids, children.
He heals people who express faith in him before the healing. To one, a blind man, he says, if you will it, you could cure me. And he says, I do will it. And to the Syrophoenician woman whose daughter is sick, he says to her, well, is it right to give bread to the dogs, meaning foreigners? And she says, even the dogs eat the crumbs from the master's table. And then he says, I have not seen such faith as this in Israel, your daughter. Go, your daughter is healed. There's always, he's looking for faith. But with Marguerite Becker, what's so extraordinary is the only faith that she had been exposed to was her failure in the catechism class and finding a rosary in the road and taking it home and putting it on her bedside table. And she didn't even know why she did it. So the children are open to God.
But I would think that the adults would, you know, oh, well, they're only children. It's hard for them to be believed.
Mm-hmm. They all, Bernadette, her parents didn't believe her, and the local bishop didn't believe her. At Lourdes, the same thing for Sister Lucia. They all go through a hard time. With Marguerite Becker in Bonheur, people disbelieved her because it was 12 days after the apparitions at Beaurang, and they said, oh, she's just copying. But then the father converts, the mother converts, then the people go to the spring, they begin to get healed. And but even then, it's in the Diocese of Liège, Belgium, and the Archbishop of Liège forms a commission to study it and to interview her and to take and listen to witnesses to the visions, and they end up having 3 separate commissions before it's officially approved by the Catholic Church. They have to study it. It's very hard for the visionaries. There's even someone in the Vatican who occupies the role of the devil's advocate. Have you heard of this? Mm-hmm. And his job is to take the other side, to disprove, to see if this is someone who's making it up or is mentally disturbed or whatever. So it's hard to be the visionary and but Our Lady wants people to hear about her apparition and to be cured and to repent. So the word, it's just like the apostles, the word has to go out and you suffer for it because you are the prophetic voice. All right? Okay, so this takes us now, there's an interesting fact and it was hard for me to decide which ones to cover, but there have been visions. Our earliest accepted one, I should say there have been visions since the early church. Our earliest approved one is Our Lady of Guadalupe in 1531 in the 16th century. But as I said, there's been visions since the early church. And in the early church, what happened was there wasn't a miracle or an unnatural happening associated with Jesus or Mary. And then a feast or a shrine would be built, and then there would be a feast. The church, one by one, decided to celebrate these visions, apparitions, by dedicating a Sunday of the year to that, or not necessarily a Sunday. Some of them were Sunday. So they became what are known as our historical feasts involving apparitions, right? But what we don't have, some of them are so early, that what we don't have is historical attestation in the form of a written document from the same time with witnesses, which is what all these commissions demand. They interview the seers, the visionaries. They interview the people around that person, who knows them, how did they do in school, were they mentally sound, and so forth. And this didn't happen historically, right? So we have Our Lady of the Pillar. Have you heard of any of these? Our Lady of the Pillar, Our Lady of the Snows. There should be an S here. Have you heard of Our Lady of the Snows? You actually have under a different name. It's the feast of the dedication of St. Mary Major Basilica in Rome. I think there's 4 major basilicas in Rome. St. Paul outside the wall, St. John Lateran, St. Peter's, and St. Mary Major. And it's really old, that church. Our Lady of the Snows, Our Lady of Walsingham, England. Have you heard of this one? Our Lady of the Rosary, also known as Our Lady, it was first known as Our Lady of Victory. Have you heard of that? There are churches named Our Lady of the Rosary. Our Lady of Mount Carmel, have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Have you heard of Our Lady of Czestochowa, the Black Madonna in Poland? Right. And Our Lady of Akita, Japan. Have you heard of that one? All right. They're not all that well known. There are many more, and now we have Our Lady of Lavang in Vietnam, which is interesting. I'll read that. That one happens in 1798. So when we come to it historically, we'll read that. So I'll tell you, this one is fascinating. Have you ever heard of the woman's name Pilar for a Hispanic woman? And you know, we have 18 Spanish-speaking countries, right? So we all know, in Spain and in the colonies of Spain that became separate countries, it was very common to name because Spain was traditionally such a Catholic country, it was traditional to name any daughter Maria. But Mary, because of the various apparitions, has many, many names. She's Our Lady of Good Counsel, Our Lady of Good Help, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, the Immaculate Conception. Let me think of them all. Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows, right? And I used to be a Spanish teacher, so I got to teach this in public school so they could understand Spanish culture. All these women whose name is Concepcion, Pilar, Consuelo, Remedios. These are all Spanish words for help, counsel, Immaculate Conception. They're all really named after Mary, but her full name in Spanish is Nuestra Señora de los Siete Dolores. Dolores, right? Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows. Nuestra Señora del Buen Consejo. Our Lady of Good Counsel. Consuelo, sorry. Nuestra Señora de los Remedios. Buenos. Our Lady of Good Help, right? Oh, come. At any rate, one of those names is Nuestra Señora del Pilar, Our Lady of the Pillar. So you know the name Pilar, you just don't know where it came from. It's in Spain and in the Spanish colonies, Mary has dozens of names. And you call your daughter the full name at baptism, but she goes by the last one. So to my students at Stratford High School, they couldn't understand, how could someone name their daughter Conception, right? But, she would go by the nickname Concha, if your name was, but it was Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. Well, also, the story of Pilar. So here's the story. And there's no written record of this story until the year 1000. And so, therefore, the church calls it a legend. They can't prove it or disprove it, right? Because it was handed down orally. There are even engravings of the Assumption of Our Lady on tombs, in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century in Spain, that and some of them with a pillar under. There's a depiction of Our Lady ascending into heaven, but with a pillar underneath it. Here's the story. The story is that, or the legend, is that in the year 40 AD, now that's not long after the death of Jesus, when Mary was still alive on earth. That's what's so amazing about this story. St. John the Greater, that would be, not St. John, St. James the Greater, that would be James, son of Zebedee, brother was John, right? Traveled as far as Spain. And each of the apostles went in different directions. And he eventually makes it to the northwest corner of Spain, which today is known as Santiago de Compostela, right? And he's the patron saint of Spain. And but on his way, he hasn't even, in 40 AD, he's on his way, and he's in what was later became known as the Kingdom of Aragon, which is next to Barcelona in northeastern Spain, on the Ebro River, which is a very famous river in Spain. And in these days, Spain is a province of the Roman Empire, right? And he's praying by the Ebro River, and he sees a vision of Our Lady. And it's prior to her Assumption, right? And then the story goes on to say that after she appeared to him, let's see, did she ask for a chapel? Let's see. No. And later on, they make depictions of this, and the claim is that as he saw her, at the same time, angels brought a statue of Mary on a pillar all the way from Israel to Spain, to Saragossa, Spain. And so there's a basilica there to Our Lady of Saragossa, and there's a pillar, and it's a very small statue. It's about this high, carved out of wood, right? It's on a very elaborate pillar, and it's there to this day. Some say there was a fire, and so the wooden statue's been carved twice, but that is known as Nuestra Señora del Pilar, Our Lady of the Pillar. What to make of this? Did angels actually bring a statue on a pillar through the air? Nobody knows. So this can never be confirmed or denied, but there's tremendous devotion in Spain and in Saragossa at this basilica to Our Lady of the Pillar. That's Our Lady of the Snows. Another really interesting story is very early. It was during the dates here are 392 to 366. That is the reign of Pope Liberius. And so the story is that there was a devout couple who had no children, and as they got on in years, they were praying to Our Lady, what should we do with our property and our funds after our death? What good use should we do? And they were praying on the 5th of August, and they were on Rome has 7 hills. They were on the Esquiline Hill, and at night, and the next morning it snowed in the middle on the 5th of August on the top of this hill in Rome. That was thought to be an extraordinary event. There's 2 versions to the story, that it happened to the couple who did have a church built. And there's been several churches, as just like St. Peter's is not the original St. Peter's, right? And now there's a basilica. But it was the first church in Rome dedicated to Mary, so it's known as the Basilica of St. Mary Major, right? Earlier, it was known as Our Lady of the Snows, when there was, I guess, a chapel built, this first. And there are paintings that I've seen of Pope Liberius standing on the hill looking down at the snow. He comes out in all of his, he's painted in all of his papal vestments, and he's looking, and he's on the top of the hill and he's looking at the snow. So in the beginning it was called Our Lady of the Snows, but then as the centuries went by, various popes said, I can't verify that this took place, is this a legend? So they began to call it the Liberian Basilica, right? And ultimately the Church of St. Mary Major. Early Christianity celebrated the Feast of Our Lady of the Snows on August 5th, and today it's still celebrated, but it's not called Our Lady of the Snows because there's 2 different versions of the legend and nobody knows what's true. And it's known as the Feast of the Dedication of St. Mary Major. Has anyone noticed that feast? I went to church on the 5th and last summer, and I noticed it and I thought, there are a lot of basilicas around the world. Why is there a feast celebrating the dedication of it? That doesn't make sense to me, right? And now I know the answer. It's because it was originally a Feast of Our Lady of the Snows, and they changed it, I think after the Council of Trent or whatever, and now it's known as the Feast of the Dedication. There's an order of priests, the missionary order of the Oblates of Mary, who are very fond of this feast, and they have a national shrine in Belleville, Illinois, and I've been there, all dedicated to Mary, and it's very beautiful. They have a hotel there, they have a restaurant there, an incredible gift shop, and at Christmas time they put on the most elaborate light show of Bethlehem and all scenes from the Bible, all done in lights, and you drive your car through the light show. You go, it's just something to see. It's beautiful, and that's known as the National Shrine of Our Lady of the Snows. So nobody knows exactly what happened, but that is the Feast of St. Mary Major, and that is the origin of one of the 4 main basilicas in Rome. Our Lady of Walsingham. This is an amazing story. All of these, the history behind them I find fascinating. In 1061, now, what happened in 1066? Anybody remember from high school? It's the Battle of
Hastings.
Yes, Hastings, right. And William the Conqueror, who is the Duke of Normandy, comes over and he claims the crown from Edward I, the Confessor, and because he's his nearest relative, right? But he has a brother-in-law who claims that he should be the successor, but he's not a blood relative. And so William the Conqueror has to fight the Duke of something, and he wins the crown, which he deserved, and Edward I wanted him to have. But just 5 years before that, a very devout English woman named Richeldes de Faverches decided, let's see, had a vision. And in her vision, she felt that Our Lady had taken her soul, her own soul, and fetched it to her own house in Nazareth, a holy house. And we're going to have another story about a holy house. Our Lady of Loretto involves Mary's house. It happens more than once. And in Nazareth. And that she asked Richeldes to build a holy house and to build a priory next to it, to reproduce what she showed her in the vision was the house in Nazareth where she grew up and where the Annunciation happened. And so she does. She's a very devout, wealthy English nobleman. She builds the holy house. And then in her will, she asks her son to build a priory, a monastery, right? An abbey is a large monastery, a prior in the Benedictine tradition, and a priory is a smaller one. And then he dies, but in his will he asks his clerk, Edwy, to build a priory, and Edwy builds the priory. And, yes. But, and it became a major pilgrimage point for royalty and Catholics in England for centuries. Pretty much every king went there, including Henry VIII. Which is very ironic because as a young man, Henry VIII married to Catherine of Aragon, was very devout, but then he doesn't have an heir and he rejects Catherine and he has Anne Boleyn and 8 wives. And later in life, because the Pope refused an annulment, he declares himself head of the church in England, and we know that is why St. Thomas More gave up his head, because he refused to sign the decree of supremacy as the head of the church, and refused to sign the decree of secession to Anne Boleyn's daughter. So during the English Reformation, Thomas Cromwell becomes the head of the church, and he's also Lord Chancellor, and he decides to suppress the minor monasteries, the priories, under the pretext that they're not being run well and that they're scandalous. But then all of those lands are appropriated, and the monasteries are destroyed, and the lands are given to noblemen that were around Henry VIII. And later on, they abolish all the monasteries. I don't know if you know the whole history of the English Reformation. I'm telling you this because, so she built the Holy House in Walsingham. And because it became over the centuries such a great pilgrimage point, pilgrims would, because of wars, they couldn't make pilgrimages to Rome or to Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem. The 3 main pilgrimage points in medieval Europe were Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela. And there were routes for these pilgrimages. You can still see them today with monasteries all along the routes. Well, in England, because of wars, they decided, well, our pilgrimage will be to Walsingham, to the Holy House. And pilgrims walked from wherever they lived in England all the way to Walsingham, which is in Norfolk. And the last mile, they took off their shoes and they walked it barefoot. So ultimately, the church built a chapel or shrine known as the Slipper Chapel, because that was where everyone took off their shoes and left them, and it became the Slipper Chapel. Then, ultimately, in the English Reformation, they destroy the priory and they destroy the church of Our Lady of Walsingham. And oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you that when this wealthy nobleman, Richeldes de Faverches, builds the Holy House, she has from Germany a carving made from Oberammergau of what Mary looked like in her vision. And she's seated on a chair, and she's got child on her left, the child Jesus on her left, and she's got a scepter. It's very beautiful, and I'll show you at the last meeting. And so in the Reformation, that's all destroyed, but they took the statue itself, which was hundreds of years old, and they took it to Lambeth Palace. Lambeth Palace is the seat of the head of the Church of England. We call him, I forget his official title. They took it there and they burned it in the Reformation. So you can imagine. But they didn't destroy the Slipper Chapel. And after the Catholic faith was suppressed in England right up till the early 1900s, you weren't allowed to be, you couldn't have a Catholic seminary. I don't know if you're aware of this, but now Catholics, it's the reason why the Catholic Cathedral in London is quite new, built in the 1930s. When you go to Westminster Cathedral, there's Westminster Abbey, which is Anglican, and Westminster Cathedral, which is the Catholic Cathedral of England. And it's new, because they weren't allowed to build. So the Slipper Chapel, after the Reformation, they didn't destroy it, they put it to secular use. It was used for something else. And when finally Catholics got the right to practice their religion in England, it went back, was restored to the Catholic Church, and so it's under Catholic Church auspices today, the Slipper Chapel. Meanwhile, the Anglican Church decided that they liked this devotion to Our Lady of Walsingham that goes back all the way to 1061, so they rebuilt the Holy House, which is owned by the Anglican Church. So today, if you go to Walsingham, and you're Catholic, you go to the Slipper Chapel, and if you're Anglican, and they both claim Our Lady of Walsingham, and there are shrines to Our Lady of Walsingham, some Catholic and some Anglican in the United States. There's one, I think, down near Washington. There's one in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I forget where there's some in some of the Spanish countries. She's quite well known, Our Lady, and she has a feast day on both the Catholic calendar and the Anglican calendar. Isn't that wild? But that's Our Lady of Walsingham. And then we come to Our Lady of the Rosary. This is one of my very favorite ones. Oh my goodness. The original name of Our Lady of the Rosary is Our Lady of Victory. I know there are churches all over the place that are called Our Lady of the Rosary, and because of the history behind it. But has anyone ever heard of the term Our Lady of Victory? Because it's the same Our Lady. Yes, where do you hear about it?
We have a devotion in my country about
Yes,
Our Lady of Victory.
and you are from
Haiti.
Haiti, yes, and yes, Notre Dame de la Victoire.
Notre Dame de la Victoire.
Right, and the European countries know way more about Our Lady of Victory than in America. But do you know the story behind Notre Dame de la Victoire?
Yes, it was when there was a fight between the Catholics and the Muslims.
Muslims, that's right.
In Turkey,
Yes,
and then
the Ottoman Empire, yeah, the
yes.
Sultan,
and then the Catholics was losing, and then
yes.
the lady appears and says, "Pray the Rosary." Everybody, instead of fighting, pray the Rosary, and then we're going to see a victory. And then it happened. To make it short, though.
Right.
It's
Rose
a
Lisa's
long
given
and
us a
beautiful
wonderful
story.
summary of Our Lady of Victory. It happens that by the late 1560s, the Ottoman Empire, which had succeeded to the earlier Muslim empires, based in Constantinople, had become more and more powerful. They had taken over, they had control of the whole Eastern Mediterranean. No ship sailed without the Ottoman Empire, and they had a huge navy, and they were very powerful. But there were some Christian settlements on the island of Cyprus, and they were the Ottoman navy, under the Sultan, was attacking them. And so Pope Pius V, I believe, organized what was known as the Holy League, and he got the Kingdom of Venice, which was a kingdom by itself in those days, and the French, and mostly the Spanish, under Charles, let's see, the king that follows, I should know this. Well, it's not, there's Ferdinand and Isabella, and then their son Charles, who abdicates in 1551. It's his son. So it's Charles, is it Charles II? He organizes, he donates the whole Spanish Navy. So they put this all together. Sailors from France, ships from France, Spain, and Venice together form a fleet, but nothing as big as the fleet that the Sultan has. And they are to set sail for Cyprus to rescue these Christian communities on the islanders, but they don't get there in time. And the Catholics lose, the Christians lose, and their communities are destroyed. And then the Spanish fleet is sailing westward, whereupon the Holy League is sailing eastward. They meet, and you know what Greece is today. You have the mainland Greece, and then you have the Peloponnesus, and then you have this bay in the Isthmus of Corinth, right? Mm-hmm. That bay that separates this big peninsula, right, is known as the Bay of Corinth. And on the northwest corner of the Bay of Corinth, the Ottoman Empire, their fleet had docked for the winter, I think. And the Holy League ships are coming in, and there are one of them for 4 of the Ottoman ships, and they engage them in battle. I have to back up and tell you, before I tell you, and it's known as the Battle of Lepanto. But prior to the sailing of the Holy League fleet, Pope Pius the Lepanto, in the Gulf of Corinth, Pope Pius V had asked everyone in Europe to pray the Rosary for the Holy League, because what they saw the threat was, at this point in the 16th century, was that if they lost, then the Ottoman Empire would invade Italy, because they already had Greece, right? And they had the north of Africa. Next would be Italy, and then they would control the whole Mediterranean, and then maybe the colonies and the New World, because once you get through Gibraltar, right? So there was great fear amongst the Christian nations of what would happen if they won. So he asked all Europe to pray the Rosary in one day, in this sea battle, in this Gulf. Was it in October?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The Holy League wins. A lot of ships were destroyed. They still have a navy. What's left retreats back to Constantinople, but never again were they the sea power they had been, and never again did Christian Europe fear that they were going to be taken over by the whole Ottoman Empire. So it was a huge turning point in the history of Western civilization, the Battle of Lepanto. But so when they won, the Pope gave all the credit to Our Lady of the Rosary. And as he sent it, before the battle happened, he went out into the streets of Rome and led a procession saying the Rosary, the Pope Pius V. So she received all the credit, and everyone thanked Our Lady of the Holy Rosary. But she was first known as Our Lady of Victory. After that happened, there were a number of, in the Reformation, there was 100 years of wars in Europe, and there were many battles, and lots of people prayed to the Rosary, and there were battles won. So then it started that there was Our Lady of Victory of this town and Our Lady of Victory in this nation, and so there's a number of Our Lady of Victories, but she's now called Our Lady of the Rosary. That happened. The Battle of Lepanto is 1571. And yes, October 7th. I put down 1280 because that's 1571 is the point where all Europe now is praying the Rosary. Prior to that, the Dominican order had promoted praying of the Rosary, because Saint Dominic, when he went out in 1280 from Spain into southern France, there was a heresy known as the Albigensian heresy, and which was a dualistic idea that there were people who were so holy that they couldn't commit sin, and that the body was bad and the spirit was good. It was a Neoplatonic idea of that people could evolve into become God, and he was fighting that, and he asked people to pray the Rosary in pre-France. Let's see. Later in 1570, 2 years after the Battle of Lepanto, another Pope, Gregory XIII, changed the name to Our Lady of the Rosary, and he designated the first Sunday in October as a universal feast to Our Lady of the Rosary. Is it still October?
Yeah.
October 7th.
It's October 7th. Oh yes, after the Council of Trent, they were restoring the liturgy, and they wanted to have the regular Sunday liturgy, so they moved it to a specific date. So then it became October 7th, and not just the first Sunday in October, is Our Lady of the Rosary. But she's also Our Lady of Victory. And that is how the Rosary really became commonly used all over Europe after the Battle of Lepanto, because it was such a critical turning point at time.
But is there a vision? I may have missed something.
Is there a vision?
Yeah, related to.
There may be. Do you know, Rosalise? Is there a vision? I don't remember any vision. I haven't read of a vision. Is there a vision?
Yes.
Oh, then I have to study some more. To be continued. Is there? I'll find out if there's a vision for Our Lady of the Rosary.
And then, but the Rosary wasn't institute, I guess, at this time. When was the Rosary start, I guess?
Did you hear the question? What's the origin of the Rosary? That I have looked up. Usually, traditionally, people have credited Saint Dominic as and a vision of Saint Dominic of Our Lady, but there's books written on this, and Saint Dominic certainly promoted it, and there's another Dominican whose name I forget right after him who wrote a book on it. But prior to we know from the Dominicans that it existed prior to that with the idea of beads and saying Hail Marys and Our Fathers. But what we didn't have were the mysteries of the Rosary, and I forget at what point. It develops very slowly. In early Christianity, there was the idea of beads, and in other cultures, there are prayer on beads. Do you know this? Right?
The Muslims have.
The Muslims, right. So it was a common idea that you could repeat prayers using beads. And that got picked up and added with Christian prayers. And ultimately, the mysteries are added, and it definitely was promoted widely by St. Dominic and the Dominicans, but they didn't. The legend that Our Lady gave the Rosary to St. Dominic is not, we can't certify that, because we know a form of the Rosary existed prior to that. But it certainly was made universal after the Battle of Lepanto.
Marianne, can we just go back to the pre-France? Why, maybe my mind wandered, why is pre there?
The date 1280, that is the date in the south of France where Saint Dominic left Spain. He was born in Spain. His last name is de Guzman, and he's been asked by the head of by the local bishop to put down, he was known as such a great preacher, the order of preachers, right? And because in the south of France, many cities had gone over to a heresy that if you became holy enough, you were an evolved person, and you knew that God was a nous, a soul, a higher soul, and that the body was bad. No one should marry. Sexuality was bad, and that if you were truly evolved, you were a spirit person, not a corporeal person, body and soul. And it was a form of Neoplatonism or dualism, right? And it also posited that there was another God that was the God of physical things that was not good. So it was truly a big heresy, but it spread all over the south of France. And St. Dominic led a crusade. It's known as the Albigensian Crusade, going from town to town preaching. And he did this in 1280, and he asked people to pray the rosary. So it already existed by that time, but he didn't create it, as far as we know.
But that's where, that, in that town is where he,
That is where he began asking people, preaching against the Albigensian heresy, and asking people, but it actually becomes a universal prayer of the church right after the Battle of Lepanto because of Pope Pius V. So it goes through Dominic and up and out with them.
I believe Saint Louis de Montfort has a lot to do with the rosary, spreading the rosary.
Yes. She's talking about Saint Louis of Montfort in France, and he's active in the 1800s, I think. And he's a wonderful story. I don't think he has an apparition, but I can look up more on him. He's a huge devotee of Our Lady, and you may remember some of his sayings. He lived like an absolute pauper and lived in the cities. Every French city had a Hôtel Dieu, which was a pauper's hospital, a place where street people could go. And he got himself ordained as a priest, but he was not in favor in the hierarchy. And so he never got a parish, and so he took a place. He asked the nuns that ran the Hôtel Dieu, I forget in which town, and could I have a bed in your hospital, and then I will care for and I will wash the patients and care for the poor. A humble, holy man. And then ultimately he went out preaching, and he built shrines all over western France to Our Lady. Beautiful, beautiful shrines that later in the Revolution, I have to look up his dates. France goes through many anti-clerical periods. They got torn down. His shrines, to move forward. And he left many writings, very holy man. The one saying that sticks with me from St. Louis de Montfort. Have any of you done 33 days to morning glory? Okay, then you know all about St. Louis de Montfort, right? What sticks with you? What saying from him?
I don't have a particular thing in mind, no.
The perfect place, if you're in anxiety or if you're feeling great need, the perfect place to dwell is the space in between, the holiest space for you to be in your mind, is between Mary at the foot of the cross and Jesus on the cross. Put yourself there. That just hits me in my heart in such a way I can't describe. No matter how distressed we can become, we can place ourselves spiritually between Mary and Jesus on the cross. Think about that. I find that hugely restorative. It takes you out of whatever you were worrying about, right? And we can do that. We can place ourselves between Mary and Jesus on the cross. We can do it. But so he's a wonderful saint. I'll have to go look and see if he has a vision. And then let's see what time it is. We just have time for one more. A couple more. Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Does anyone know the story of Our Lady of Mount Carmel? You know where Mount Carmel is?
In Israel.
In Israel. Where in Israel?
And the mountain.
Yes, there's a headland that
And
sticks
the
up.
mountain is called Mount Carmel.
And it's called Carmel. It's north of Tel Aviv, south of, I forget what city. If you look at the coast of Israel, of the eastern Mediterranean, comes down like this, and there's a little jut out here, and then it comes down here, and Egypt is here, and Turkey is here. And this is Mount Carmel right here. And it sticks up. Haifa is right below. And on that mountain is a cave. And it is supposed to be the cave where Elijah the prophet went. He was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. And he was being persecuted because there were false prophets of Yahweh that were functioning at a sanctuary in Bethel, which was not the true sanctuary. The true sanctuary was the Temple of Jerusalem, right? And he went up there and preached against him and against this wicked king, King Ahab. And King Ahab has a terrible wife that he married from some foreign country named Jezebel. You know the story, right?
Yeah.
And she wears lots of makeup, and she's wicked. And she has these false priests all around her, hundreds of them. And so Ahab and Jezebel decide they're going to kill, they have a contest between the false prophets of Ahab, and Isaiah challenges them and to make an animal sacrifice, dig a moat, put water in it. In the middle is wood and the sacrificial animals to be offered to Yahweh. And Isaiah says, you priests will stand back, I will stand back. First you pray and ask God to light that animal sacrifice. And then I will pray. And whoever God answers to will be the true prophets. Remember the story? This is it's in First or Second Kings. And so of course they all pray and nothing happens. And then Elijah prays and the whole thing goes up in flames. And now they're furiously mad, and they're after him because they had already slain other Jewish prophets. And so Ahab wants to kill him, and he runs away to the desert, and then eventually he runs up to Mount Carmel, and he's just distraught. Because there's a famine in the land, and there's nothing to eat. And God speaks to him in the cave. And first he looks for God in the fire, he looks in the whirlwind, he looks for God in many different physical manifestations, and finally he hears God in a slight, small whisper. It's beautiful. And that's the cave. Now, fast forward to the 1100s, and we have the Crusades. And you know there were many Crusades, and by about the second or third, I forget, the European knights that have come, the Crusader groups, actually take control of Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims, right? And they start monasteries, and they are able to hold it. It's called the Crusader States, right? And they are able to hold the land in Christian hands for only 100 years, and then it goes, I think Saladin comes in, another Muslim, and they take it all back, right? But during those 100 years, they're known as the Crusader States, and there's even a Christian king of Jerusalem who comes from France. But during this period, hermits were showing up and living in Carmel. And the very first hermits lived in the cave of Elijah on Mount Carmel. And these brothers, this loose confederation of brothers, and eventually, after the Muslims come back, they leave there, and some of them go to England. And one of those, and they form a monastery there, calling themselves the Carmelites, after where they started. And there's one of them who became the abbot is St. Simon Stock. And he receives a vision from Our Lady in which she gives him the scapular. It's known as the brown scapular, and I have grandchildren who wear them, never take them off. And she promises that anyone who wears the brown scapular, with the picture of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she has a crown on, and she holds Jesus. It's very like the statue of Our Lady that we have over on the parish center. When you drive onto the grounds, it's very like that. That might even be Our Lady of Mount Carmel. I'm not. Do you know?
I'm not sure that's her.
It might not be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have. When I show you the pictures at the end, I have to compare her, but she reminds me of Our
Oh, that's
Lady.
very close. Yeah.
It's very close. So they relocate, and from there they spread to many places, and the Carmelites are in the United States, they're all over the world. But this was in the mid-1200s. So the church decided that the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel would be July 16th. And it was honored, Our Lady of Mount Carmel was honored with a feast day in the latter part of the 14th century. Yes. So these are historical feasts that we don't have historical verification of what took place, but they got their own feast days.
But there's a
think-
lot of people behind this. We have one shrine in New York City, the upper side, upper west side,
Yes,
and the upper east side, I should say, and then the, it's amazing how many people that goes there.
yes, and I am on the board of directors of the Avila Institute, which is the educational arm of the Carmelite Sisters for the Aged and Infirm. They run nursing homes all over the United States. They have 25 of them. They used to run St. Joseph's Manor in Trumbull until Bishop Egan sold that to a for-profit chain. But he negotiated that it's still known as St. Joseph's Center, but the nuns couldn't stay there even though they built it and they ran it. Because, well, it's a long story how that happened. But we have to stop now, but there's a couple more that I find really interesting. Our Lady of Czestochowa and Our Lady of Akita, Japan. Did you ever hear of that?
Yes,
You know about it? Yes.
I love Mother Mary.
Right, it's another religious, Sister Agnes Katsuko Sasagawa. Okay, well, to be continued in 2 weeks. We'll look at those, and, we'll also include Our Lady of Lavon. I should have read that sooner.